So, Mallory, now we are doing our kind of one-on-one, and one of these conversations really kind of was the impetus on us doing this. Was a conversation we had just talking about, what is this conversation about race look like? This, I think, on your side, the allyship, and on my side, being open to including, white people in this conversation about where we're going. So, thanks for joining me here. So I know as we had,
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
yeah, I think we had a little bit of a delay, but yeah, go ahead.
All good. Yeah. Do you want to, because it was slow, do you want to do your part again?
Yeah,
And
I can do that.
cut it
So,
out.
so Mallory, thanks for taking a couple moments and doing our kind of first one-on-one, really noting that this is what started the idea for a podcast, us having just a kind of off the line, in-person conversation about allyship and race in this conversation. And I think from my perspective, it's so important to have people like you who are open and willing to have conversations in your community and empower people. And I think it helped me come to this space as I think about my role as a man, thinking about what I think people often consider women's issues. When it's like violence against women is a men's problem. It is a men's issue. It is not a woman's issue. It is not a thing where women are out here raping and assaulting each other the same way when we talk about racism. It's often like this black issue. It's like, no, black people are not lynching and beating and doing all those kind of things to black people. So, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective about this kind of moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really unique moment, and I talked about it on the Senate floor, and I think this is true universally, that for a lot of us, we are afraid to talk about things that aren't necessarily our inherent experience. For fear of number one, there's this idea that it's not my story to tell, and I don't want to take that away from somebody. But also that I don't necessarily know what to say. So, I was brought up to almost kind of not give hate the light of day. So we've had, some constituent calls to our office that have been disturbing and, are racist. And particularly during the shutdown, we had some really, really concerning calls. And my gut reaction was, that is somebody who doesn't deserve a response. It doesn't deserve the dignity of a response. But I think what I've realized, especially watching all of these protests and listening to your guys' stories on the floor about your lived experience, is that every time somebody like me does that, it's not telling that person that feeling or that reaction is wrong. And I think you see that throughout. My district is 2 miles north of Detroit is where it starts, but it's an 80% white district outside of an 80% black city. And what you see for the first time is there have been protests for Black Lives Matter in Troy, in Rochester, in Birmingham, in Royal Oak. And, it's predominantly white people who are trying to figure out how to help and wanting to say, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a part of the solution. And I don't necessarily know how yet. But to your point, it reminded me of, when we're talking about women's issues, when there was an incident, a few months ago talking about sexual harassment, when it's only women talking about it, it never gets solved. And we need men to be a part of that conversation, to call out other men and say, this behavior is unacceptable. And I think that made me realize, I have to be a part of this conversation for my friends and neighbors and colleagues and residents who aren't in the same position that I am.
Well, let me just say, it was really moving for me as I was sitting on the floor and you were talking about your experience. It really made a big difference to me, because people will say things to you now that they know that they can no longer say to me, right? And as we talk about this space, as we talk about this moment, I think as a Black man, it means so much to see people saying, hey, your life does matter. And there is value in that. And, even in that moment, I'm recognizing it's like, oh, shoot. Even in this moment, there is so much privilege to being a Black man, right? So people know George Floyd's name, but no one is talking, people are not talking about Breonna Taylor in the same way, right? Like, people are not doing those kind of things. And so it's a constant movement of saying, hey, in this place where I have privilege, where I have power and ability, I should be leveraging that amongst all the people who are giving me a platform. And I think as we talk about being an ally, that's what's most important. I have a really good Army buddy, and he is a white guy from Wisconsin who wants to do the right thing, is an Army officer playing the can't be too political, but wants to be supportive of these things. He's like, well, what do I do? And I was like, you being willing to have this conversation and having these conversations with the special operations community that you are a part of makes all the difference, because you're the liberal in that group. I mean, he's not a liberal in a normal sense of the word, but he's the liberal in that space, and can be the the first person to talk about that. And I think that's really a big role that you play, of being open and saying, hey, this is a space.
Well, and it just, it really challenged me. There was a Black woman in my district, a mom, who reached out to me and, said very candidly, as all of these protests were happening and we saw what was happening around the country, she said, I fear for my son's life because of what he looks like. Is he going to grow up and get arrested and get treated poorly, or be targeted because of the color of his skin, when he might not be doing anything wrong? And in the back of my head, I'm listening to your voice from the floor talking about, when your car broke down and what happened to you there, or Marshall's story about when he gets pulled over and he's got to lower all the windows and tell all of his kids that we're playing the quiet game. And, it just really stuck with me, because when I get pulled over, my biggest fear is, am I going to get a ticket for speeding? But I was speeding and I deserve a ticket, right? Like, that's kind of what I go through, and it just stuck with me. And, has there been anything that you've realized, almost maybe subconsciously, that you do that we should talk about, that are different, just different ways that we live?
I mean, that's my whole, as we've been going through this, my whole life, I realized how much I have been programming myself to be safe, right? Like, when I run through my neighborhood, I wear a high visibility Army vest, right? It says my rank, it says U.S. Army, it's super bright. I wear the brightest, highlighter colors, because I want people to know I'm out exercising. I'm not running from anything. I'm not running to any place. I am running for exercise. And I have to do that, right? When you look at Ahmaud Arbery, those moments, you look at Trayvon Martin, you look at all these moments where people justify these extrajudicial killings by saying that they were doing something wrong, right? When I talk to my daughter about the space, we talk about, how does it mean to be safe? When I think about her getting in the car, when I do all of those kind of moments, it's just a very different experience from the moment we start living to everything. So, it's a really unique and different way to live our lives. And I think as a legislator, one of the things that I imagine you can relate to being a woman is, I spend a lot of time not talking about race, right? I'm playing the coded game the same way, right? I'm talking about urban issues and economic development. I want to say Black people need this thing, but I know that will turn things off, right? In this moment, I have been able to talk more about it, because I now know people are open and able to listen. But there's always this back and forth of needing to advocate, because I am one of 2 Black men in the Senate, for Black men and Black men's issues, but also knowing that I have to deliver, right? I've got to get those results. And if everything I say is Black, then people are like, I don't want to do that, or they don't so it's this really unique balance where I'm always constantly trying to do the math in my mind of, did I say it too many times? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Because people perceive it very differently, right? So I'm wearing this Cornell football shirt in honor of, the Ivy League canceling all fall sports, and somebody's
no sports. RIP sports.
Somebody's got to wear the Cornell football this year. But I was wearing a Cornell tie in Lansing as a staffer, and it's a red and white tie. And a woman walked up and she was like, "Oh, did you go to Wayne State?" And I was like, red, white. I was like, "It's my school tie." And she was like, "Yeah, did you go to Wayne State?" I was like, "No, Wayne State's colors are green and white and some gold. Red and white, Cornell." And so it's just this perception thing that I think we've really got to work on.
Well, but I think that's the power in other people stepping into that space with you. Because I have that same fear around women's issues, right? I ran for office in 2018 for the first time, which turned into the year of the woman, which I didn't know when I started running. But all of a sudden, that's your story. You're a woman running in the year of the woman, and we're all the same. And that's been my fear coming in is, do I talk about women's issues too much? Is this going to be what I'm pegged at? And is that going to turn people off? And am I not talking about a broad enough set of issues? But when people like you jump in and join me and say, no, no, this is everybody's issue, then I think that gives me the freedom and flexibility to realize that if the women in the legislature aren't talking about and advocating for women's issues, who is?
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that's the same way, where hopefully, you know, you and Erica and Marshall and Sylvia and Betty Jean can feel more comfortable continuing to advocate for issues that affect Black people, knowing that, you know, I will be there with you. And hopefully that gives us more leverage to keep advocating, because we have to, for the people that we represent.
And as you talk about that, you know, I don't want it to be lost that you had to do those same gymnastics when you had a unacceptable experience in the office with a colleague that you were able to deal with and handle because of your work needs. But when another woman, a younger woman who did not have that same level of power, you had no choice but to step up. And you had to do it when every single one of us saw that same behavior and didn't say anything. And so I think it's really important to note that when you were asked to step up, or when you saw a need and really had to do it, you did. And in those same moments, that's a mistake on our part that we weren't standing up and talking about that ahead of time. And I think as people think about what role they play as an ally, it's when you see something inappropriate, calling it out, particularly when it's happening from people who are in your sphere of influence, right? So you see man saying things that are inappropriate to women, man, stop. You know, white person seeing white people saying inappropriate things to Black people, say to white people, unacceptable. And that is, I think, the ultimate way that we talk about being allies and what can be done. So I just want to say that I appreciate the partnership and the relationships and the ability to kind of share this story as we talk about kind of these moments of, you know, I don't know what to do, but it's funny as we talk about the difference in growing up. I'm expecting, so I'm having a little boy, and I was having this conversation with my dad around Father's Day about the times that a firearm was held to him, where he was being held to it. This, when you're a Black man, these are the kind of conversations you have with your dad.
Yeah.
And so 2 of the 3 times, it was by a police officer. The first time, the day that Coleman Young got elected, 2 cops pulled out on my dad and just pulled him over because he was in a sports car. And they were like, you know, got out of the car, put a pistol to his head at his temple, and are like, hey, N-word, what you doing? You out celebrating, you know, because Mayor Young defeated the police commissioner. And he ran on a, God forbid, platform about ending police brutality. And he was like, oh, you're celebrating, you're feeling all happy, you're doing, you know, whatever. It's like, why did you pull him over? Oh, just because Coleman Young was going to win? Like that was a level of racial issues that we were talking about. One of the reasons I'm like, he's somebody that sending now says that we are in a different place as a nation. Sending him as a state to the Capitol saying, we recognize that there was this challenge and we are getting over, you know, our share of racism. And for one time in the world, maybe people who are not Black have to look at somebody that they have conflicting emotions with, right? Because we've always had to look at statues and say, yeah, Thomas Jefferson, very important to society, raped his sister-in-law, stepsister, you know, like George Washington, did great things for the country, had lots of slaves, right? Like, I mean, that's always the thing that we have to look at and say, what are they on balance? And that, I think, is a uniquely new thing to white people for their experience. The other 2 times, my dad was an EMT and a paramedic, and he, as a paramedic in his uniform, called the police because he was going to a scene where it was necessary. And when he got there, because he was a Black man, the police pulled up, put a gun to his back, again, while he's in uniform, right? Like that's what being Black is like in America. That's what it's like being in Detroit. And those experiences are unique and different, right?
So can I ask you though, because I think this is something that, and you know, there may not be an answer today, but you know, that these are issues that have existed since the founding of our country. And this is not something that is new. This is not something that started, but even, when Ferguson happened and we saw protests then, the idea of even saying Black Lives Matter was scandalous. That did not pick up then. And I think people had such a visceral reaction in that it's you versus me, and that somehow if you're acknowledged, then that means you're more important than us. And that doesn't mean, and we saw the reactions from that. Why do you think it is that it's taken hold now? I mean, is it the timing? Is it the fact that it was during a pandemic and all of these things happened at once? Because it is so radically different. I mean, the fact that there are all these protests in my district supporting Black Lives Matter, when if you said that a few years ago, that was a radical idea that people pushed back on because it turned into us versus them and you versus me. And now it feels more like people are like, yes, Black lives do matter. How can I help?
Yeah, I think so much of it was the pandemic, right? People couldn't avoid this other thing, right? I think because of the pandemic, people were looking for a bad guy, right? You can't be mad at a virus. So people were looking for a bad guy. And racism is a good bad guy. And you couldn't ignore that, there was no ambiguity in, that police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. Like there was there was none of that. But this wasn't the first time that happened. This wasn't the first time that you saw a Black man under a police officer saying, I can't breathe. It wasn't the first time that you saw in Breonna Taylor a no-knock warrant being used and a completely innocent person being killed. I mean, Ayanna Stanley, a young Black girl, was killed errantly in a raid. I mean, so these things have been happening. I think now we're in a world where people couldn't ignore it. And because they couldn't ignore it, they had to grapple with, is that who you are, right? It's one thing to know that bad things happen in the world. It's another thing to see bad things happening consistently every day, to know that you could be doing something about it, have nothing else to do, and still not be doing it, right? So in a normal situation, you can say, oh, I can't go to that event because I got to work, or I can't do that because I got to do this. You don't have any of those things. All you have to do right now—
captured attention.
Yeah, all you have to do right now is wear a mask, social distance, or go protest injustice. So I think a lot of people were like, oh, this is fundamentally an issue. But we've always seen a little bit of progress, and it always has gone in somewhat leaps and bounds. So I'm interested. I'm grateful that we're starting to see some of those changes. But the only momentum that will come is when real people start to demand these real changes and recognize that change is hard, but also that it means things that will be given up, right? Like there are a lot of privileges inherent in being a man, in being white, in being cisgender, in being, all of those kind of things make a huge difference in your ability to exist in the world, is being more like the majority of people. And if you are in that space, you have to be willing to accept that maybe there will be less of that. There will be less advantages. And I think that's a hard thing for people to grapple with. So I appreciate you being willing to help.
Yeah, it's going to be a long journey, but at least in the Senate, we've got 2 more years in our first term, 2.5. we got some time.
Cool. So thanks for having this conversation. Thanks for the first JAMS podcast. And so we'll be continuing to do these, and we'll do the bigger things, and we'll continue to have these one-on-one interviews, kind of the 4 of us, so you get a chance to get to know us, the issues that matter to us, and some of the important things going on in the world. So
yeah, I'm Mallory McMorrow.
I'm
see you
Adam
next time.
Hollier, and I'll see you soon. All right, so